Steven Universe is a strange show to come back to. It ran from 2013 to 2019 on Cartoon Network. Then it had a movie. Then it had a follow-up series called Steven Universe Future that wrapped up in early 2020. 5 seasons plus the film, plus 20 epilogue episodes. Around 180 episodes in total, depending on how you count the shorts and the Steven Bomb runs and so on. And in all that time, loads of stuff got introduced that never quite got resolved. Not in a frustrating way, mind. More in the way an old friend tells you about the weird thing that happened to their cousin once and then just never brings it up again, and you don't push, because the story was never really the point. That's the sort of thing we're doing tonight. Wandering through the unsolved mysteries of Steven Universe, the stuff the show set up and never finished, the questions it raised and quietly walked away from, the background details that got left in the corner of the frame for someone to notice 5 years later, if they happen to be looking. Some of these are big. There's a giant fused gem made of millions of shattered consciousnesses sitting in the molten core of the earth. Bubbled. Sentient. Still down there. The show calmed it down, then more or less moved on. There's a small pink character who stood perfectly still in a garden for thousands of years, because she was told to. There's a locked treasure chest in a magical lion's mane that gets shown to the audience again and again, sealed, taunting. And then in the movie, it's just sitting open in the background of one shot, and nobody ever explains what was inside or how it got opened. Some of these are smaller. A pink-haired girl on a motorcycle gives Pearl her phone number, and the show never tells us if Pearl ever called. A handful of red soldiers get launched into space, and the show essentially forgets about them. A whole rebellion that lasted 1,000 years happens almost entirely off-screen, summarized in flashbacks and a few stained battlefields. Anyway, I want to be upfront about something before we get into all this. None of these unresolved threads ruin the show. Steven Universe is, in my opinion, one of the best things Cartoon Network has ever made, and I'm not interested in doing the thing where you pick a show apart to prove it doesn't work. It absolutely works. It works partly because it's not the kind of show that needs every loose end tied off. The whole spirit of it is that healing is messy, that relationships don't resolve neatly, that some people just walk into your life and walk out again, and you never find out what happened to them. That's life. That's also Beach City. So this isn't a takedown. Nothing like that. This is more like sitting on the floor of the temple at 3 a.m, just thinking about the bits of the show that have stuck with you for years and never quite settled. The locked chest, the garden, the mirror, the bubble room, the phone number, all of it. If you've never seen Steven Universe, that's fine too. I'll set up each of these things from scratch as we go. I'm not going to assume you remember every episode because honestly, neither do I. Some of this stuff I had to look up properly before recording because it's been a while since I last sat down with the show in any serious way. There's a lot of it. The Steven Universe wiki is its own kind of rabbit hole. 12 mysteries. We'll wander through them at our own pace. Some are short, some are longer. None of them really build to anything. They sit alongside each other like rooms in the same building. You can drift off whenever you like. The next one will still be there in the morning, or it won't, and either way, it'll be fine. If you want to subscribe before we get going, that's lovely, and it genuinely helps the channel. But I'm not going to keep banging on about it. Tonight's about the show, so let's start with the chest. Picture a pink lion. Big, soft-faced, slightly melancholy in the way that all of Steven Universe's animal characters are slightly melancholy. He's sleeping on a beach somewhere in Delmarva. And inside the mane of this pink lion, in a pocket dimension that opens up when you stick your head into his fur, there's a tree, a sword in the ground, a flag, a videotape, a few of Rose Quartz's belongings, and one locked chest. That's the image. The whole mystery is in the image. Really? The chest just sits there. Lion himself first appears in the 11th episode of season 1, in an episode called Steven's Lion. Steven finds him in the desert, and the lion sort of adopts him, the way a cat that wants something will adopt anyone. We don't find out about the pocket dimension in his mane until later, when Steven accidentally falls into it. And inside the dimension, alongside all the other artifacts, there's a chest, locked, sealed, not opening for anyone. The The show teases this for ages, years, in real time. Stephen keeps finding interesting things in Lion's mane, and we keep getting glimpses of the chest in the background. Pearl's old swords are in there, Bismuth's gem is in there, bubbled and forgotten. Rose's videotape for Stephen is in there. Loads of significant stuff, all explained eventually. The chest stays shut. Then in season 4, there's an episode called The Lion 4 Alternate Ending, aired in May 2017. And in that episode, Lion coughs up a key, a pink one. Stephen very reasonably assumes the key is for the chest. He goes into the main dimension, finds the chest, tries the key. It doesn't fit. He tries the key on every other lock he can find. The door to Rose's secret armory, Rose's fountain, Rose's room in the temple. None of them. He even tries to unlock himself because he's 12 and that's the kind of thing 12-year-olds do. Doesn't work either. The episode turns out to be about something else entirely. The key leads to a tape Greg made, where it's revealed that if Stephen had been born a girl, his name would have been Nora. That's the actual emotional payload of the episode, and it's a lovely one. But the chest is left exactly as it was, locked, untouched, no key. And that's where things sat for the rest of the show. The chest never opens on screen. Not in any episode of the original series, not in the season 5 finale, not in any of the dramatic confrontations with the diamonds. Whatever's in that chest stays in that chest, until the movie, Steven Universe. The movie came out in September 2019. It's set 2 years after the events of the main series, and it's mostly about Spinel turning up to ruin everyone's day, which we'll get to later. There's a sequence in the movie called Happily Ever After, which is essentially a dream pop musical number where Stephen walks around showing the audience what life on Earth is like, now that the war's over and everything's settled. And in the background of one shot, very briefly, you can see the inside of Lion's main dimension. The tree's still there, the flag's still there, and the chest is open. That's it. That's the whole reveal. The chest is open in the background of one shot in a song. The film does not stop to explain this. No character mentions it. No flashback shows Stephen finally figuring out the lock. It's just open now. Whatever was in it has presumably been removed or is still in there or never existed, depending on how you want to read it. I find this genuinely funny. I find it funny in the way that the best loose ends are funny, where you can't tell if the writers forgot about it or if they decided the joke was leaving it permanently ambiguous. Both options are valid. There are interviews where Rebecca Sugar has been asked about the chest, and as far as I can tell from digging around, she's never given a straight answer. She'll talk about Lion's whole symbolic role in the show happily, but the chest specifically just stays a closed then open prop. Fans have come up with theories, obviously. Some of them are charming. The most popular one is that the chest contained the pink jacket Stephen wears in the movie, a piece of clothing that suddenly exists without explanation. The theory is that Rose left it in there for him, and he found it off screen, which is sweet, but also a bit anticlimactic, because if it was just a jacket, why have the chest at all? Why lock it? Why tease it for 4 full seasons? Another theory is that the chest contained nothing, that it was a running visual joke, a Chekhov's gun the writers planted in season 1 and then forgot about, and by the time they noticed it again in season 5, it was too late to do anything meaningful with it, so they just opened it in the background of a song and moved on. This theory has the advantage of being almost certainly partly true, in my opinion. Television shows are made by people. People forget things. And the show was famous for being made under a lot of network pressure, with frequent hiatuses. A more interesting theory, and the one I keep going back to, is that the chest contained something Pink Diamond hid from herself. Lion is connected to Rose, who is Pink, and Lion's mane contains the parts of Pink's life she wanted to put away. The other artifacts in there are things she chose to keep but couldn't quite face every day. The videotape goodbye, Bismuth's bubbled gem, the sword she fought with, the chest, by extension, would be the most private thing of all, something even more buried. And by the time of the movie, Stephen had grown into the kind of person who could face whatever was in there, so he opened it. We just don't get to see what it was. I like that reading because it doesn't actually require the show to tell us anything. It lets the chest mean something thematically without needing a literal answer. One more detail worth knowing about Lion himself while we're here. Buddy's book, an episode in season 4, shows that Lion was originally just a normal lion, a wild one, living in a pride in the desert hundreds of years before the show. Rose ran around with these lions, apparently. There's a journal entry from a 1700s explorer called Buddy Budwick, who finds Rose hanging out with them. So the chest predates Stephen by a long way, and possibly predates Lion's resurrection too. Whatever's is in it, it's old. There's something quite tender about all this when you sit with it. The whole point of the chest, in a way, is that it doesn't matter what's in it. The locked thing in your magical adoptive mother's afterlife pocket dimension, the thing she left behind that you spent 4 years trying to get into, eventually just opens. You stop trying. You grow up a bit. Life moves on. And then one day there it is. Open. Whatever was inside has been integrated into your life or thrown away or kept in a cupboard, and the chest is just a chest now. That might be a load of overthinking on my part, mind you. It might just be a chest the writers forgot to deal with. Either way, that's where it stands. The thing's open. The contents are unknown. Lion is presumably still asleep on the beach somewhere. Now, while we're on the topic of things sitting around for ages waiting for someone to come back, let's talk about Spinel. 6,000 years is the number to keep in mind here. Standing perfectly still in a garden, no movement at all, just patience. That's the situation. And it's the kind of premise that sounds like a fairy tale until you sit with it for a bit and start working out what it actually means. Spinel is the main antagonist of Steven Universe, the movie. She's pink, almost cartoonishly pink, with long noodly arms and a face like a Looney Tunes character. She bounces, she squeaks. Her whole design is built around the idea of comic relief sidekick, and then the movie reveals what she's actually been doing for 6 millennia. And the design starts to feel less funny and more like something out of a horror story. Here's the setup. Way back before the events of the main show, Pink Diamond, the youngest and least respected of the 4 diamonds who run the Gem Empire, was given Spinel as a gift. This was after Pink had lost her original pearl to White Diamond as punishment, which is a whole separate mystery we'll get to later. The other diamonds gave Pink this new Spinel character to cheer her up. Spinel was, essentially, a court jester. Her entire reason for existing was to play with Pink, make her laugh, distract her, keep her happy. That's the role she was made for. And for a while it worked. Pink and Spinel had a private garden, which we see in flashback during the movie. Pink would visit Spinel there, and the two of them would mess about, play games, fall over each other, all very sweet. There's a song sequence that captures this, and it's genuinely lovely until you remember where it's heading. Then Pink finally gets what she's been asking for from the other diamonds, her own colony. Earth, Yellow and Blue ring her up to give her the news, and Pink takes the call from the garden. Spinel is right there, doing her usual bouncing about, very excited because she's assuming she's going too. And Pink, in a moment that the movie shows in detail, gets embarrassed. Embarrassed by Spinel's silliness in front of the other diamonds. Embarrassed at being seen as the kind of diamond who plays with a clown. So she pulls Spinel aside and tells her they're going to play a new game. Spinel has to stand perfectly still. No moving. Don't move until I come back. And Spinel, who lives entirely to please Pink, agrees. She stands still. Pink leaves for Earth. Pink never comes back. Pink starts the rebellion. Pink invents her Rose Quartz disguise. Pink fakes her own shattering. Pink falls in love with a human called Greg. Pink gives up her physical form to give birth to Steven. By the time the events of the original series begin, Pink Diamond, as a person, essentially doesn't exist anymore. And Spinel is still in the garden, still standing still. For all that time. The thing that makes this hit so hard, when you really think about it, is that gems don't experience time the way we do. They're functionally immortal. They don't sleep. They don't need food. They don't have bodies that wear out. Yellow Diamond mentions in one episode that 6,000 years is essentially nothing to a gem, the way a long weekend feels to us. So in one reading, Spinel just stood still through what was, for her, a sort of prolonged afternoon. But the movie doesn't let us off that easily. There's a song called Drift Away, which Spinel sings during her flashback to the garden. And the lyrics make it really clear that she was conscious through all of it. She felt the time pass. She watched the flowers around her wither and the place fall apart. She started doubting Pink, then forgiving Pink, then doubting again, in cycles for centuries. The movie shows her cycling through emotional states like a sped-up time lapse. So what we're actually looking at is a sentient being, fully aware, abandoned by the only person she was made to serve, holding a pose that becomes a punishment because the person who said it never came home. I find that genuinely upsetting in the way that the best Steven Universe stuff is upsetting. The show didn't shy away from making its villains' motivations make sense. Spinel's not wrong. The diamonds were terrible to her. Pink, in particular, was terrible to her. The whole movie hangs on this. Spinel arrives on Earth ready to destroy all organic life as revenge, and you completely understand why, even as you're rooting against her. There's a fun detail in the garden flashback that I only noticed after a rewatch. The flowers in the background include forget-me-nots, which is a touch on the nose but works, and red spider lilies, which in Japanese folklore are associated with loss and final goodbyes. Whoever was art directing that scene was being properly thoughtful about it. The thing the movie does answer is how Spinel finally found out. She heard Steven's broadcast at the end of Change Your Mind, the season 5 finale, where Steven essentially announces to the galaxy that things on Earth are different now, that gems are free, that the diamonds have been talked round, and from that, Spinel pieces together what happened. She hears about Pink Diamond no longer existing, about Steven being her son, about Earth being Pink's old project, and she puts it all together in real time. And then she snaps and decides to go to Earth and ruin it. What the movie doesn't really answer, and what I keep coming back to, is what happens to her after. The end of the film has her going to live on Homeworld with the other diamonds. White, yellow, and blue have agreed to look after her. They've apparently realized finally that they should have been kinder to Pink and by extension kinder to all the people Pink left behind. There's a reformation thing going on. Spinel is going to get a fresh start. Steven Universe Future, the follow-up series, doesn't really revisit Spinel in any depth she's mentioned. We hear that she's doing okay on Homeworld. There's the implication that the diamonds are looking after her properly this time, but we don't actually see how that's going. We don't see what therapy looks like for someone who stood still for that long. We don't see whether she has her own friends now or what she does with her time, or whether she sometimes thinks about the garden, which is fair, in a way. Future was a short follow-up series, and most of those episodes went to Steven himself, who was having a pretty serious mental health crisis of his own. There wasn't a lot of room for a Spinel-focused episode, but it does mean she sits in the same category as everyone else on this list, a character with a huge unresolved emotional landscape that the show acknowledged and then gently set aside. There's one more thing worth mentioning before we move on: the garden itself. It's a big floating rock with a glass dome over it, full of flowers, accessed by a warp pad. After Spinel leaves, the garden is presumably still there, drifting through space, slowly falling apart. The show never tells us what happens to it. Whether it gets restored, whether it gets demolished, whether Spinel ever goes back to visit, it just sits up there the way these things do, waiting for someone to remember it. I sometimes wonder if part of the appeal of Steven Universe for me as an adult is that it takes seriously the idea that places hold memories, that a garden where you were happy once still exists somewhere, even after the person you were happy with has left. There's a lot of that running through the show. Rose's Fountain, the Strawberry Battlefield, the kindergarten where Amethyst was born, all of these places where huge emotional things happened, sitting empty most of the time, occasionally visited by characters who don't quite know what to do with them. The garden is one of those. Spinel's not in it anymore, but it's still there, presumably, still falling apart slowly. Right. Speaking of characters whose backstories don't get filled in, let's talk about White Diamond. Or rather, let's talk about the very specific shape of the absence around her. If you go to the Steven Universe wiki and look up White Diamond, there's a line in her entry that's almost funny in how upfront it is. It says, more or less verbatim, that nothing is known about her exact past. That's the wiki for a show with thousands of pages of meticulously cataloged lore. Pearls and rubies have detailed entries with subheadings about minor relationships. Whole episodes have full transcripts. And the most powerful character in the whole hierarchy, the head of the Great Diamond Authority, the gem who's been ruling the galaxy for an unspecified but enormous amount of time, has a backstory that just reads as a shrug. She shows up properly in the season 5 finale, Change Your Mind, which aired in January 2019. Before that, we'd seen statues of her in ancient gem ruins. We'd heard her name in hushed tones and we'd glimpsed her on the moon base, but she hadn't actually appeared as a character. When she finally turned up, she was enormous, blindingly white, perfectly composed, and clearly older and more powerful than the other two diamonds put together. The other diamonds defer to her. They behave like children around her. There's a real sense, in the way the show frames her, that she's been doing this for so long that she's stopped really seeing other people as people. Her stated philosophy, the one thing we do learn about her, is that she exists to make everything better. That's how she puts it. Her job is to impose order on the universe, to keep gems in their proper roles, to ensure that the empire runs smoothly. And the way she does that is by enforcing a really strict caste system, where every kind of gem has its assigned role and is not allowed to deviate from it. Pearls serve, rubies guard, quartzes fight, diamonds rule. That's the system. And she's been running it, by all accounts, for thousands and thousands of years without much in the way of resistance. We know she owned the most colonies at the time of Earth's colonization. We know that, according to Blue Diamond, she used to be closer to the other diamonds. Apparently she played games with Pink, Yellow, and Blue back when Pink was much younger. She had what sounds like a maternal relationship with Pink, specifically, calling her by the nickname Starlight, which is the kind of thing you call a small child you love and don't take seriously. And the show makes it pretty clear that her decision to deny Pink a colony, and her general dismissiveness of Pink's feelings, was one of the things that pushed Pink into rebellion in the first place. That's it though. That's the whole of what we get. Where she came from, how old she actually is, whether she had a creator, whether other diamonds existed before her, whether she was always like this or whether something happened to make her this way. None of that gets answered. Steven Universe, as a show, was very into giving its characters flashback episodes. Pearl gets one, several actually, where we see her time on Homeworld and her relationship with Pink. Garnet gets The Answer, which is one of the most beloved episodes of the show, where we see Ruby and Sapphire meeting for the first time. Bismuth gets her whole introduction episode where we learn what she was doing during the rebellion. Lapis gets Same Old World, where we see her getting trapped in the mirror. Even Spinel, who's only in the movie, gets the equivalent of a flashback episode through her song. The pattern is well established. If you're a major character in Steven Universe, you generally get an episode that shows us where you came from. White Diamond doesn't get one. Not in the original series, not in the movie, not in future. She just exists, fully formed, as old as anyone in the show. There's a fun thread to pull at here, which is that the show never really explains where any diamonds come from. Quartzes emerge from kindergartens, which we see in detail. Pearls are made for diamonds, custom ordered. Most other gem types are produced via established processes that the show explains. But the diamonds themselves just are. They don't seem to have parents, they don't seem to have a creation process. They appear to have always been in charge. Some fans have theorized that the diamonds are the original gems and that everyone else came from them somehow. Others have suggested that there used to be more diamonds, maybe a black diamond, maybe other colors, and that white is just the last one standing from some ancient power struggle. There's no canon support for any of this, but it's the kind of speculation the show invites by being so quiet about its own creation myth. I dug into Rebecca Sugar's behind-the-scenes book, which is called Steven Universe: End of an Era. It's full of concept art and notes and early ideas. There's a fair amount about Pink Diamond and the other characters. There's some great stuff on the Pearls. There's not much at all about White's origins. Sugar talks about her design, about her voice, about the specific shape of her cape. But the actual question of where she came from doesn't get cracked open even in a supplementary book that's specifically about the show's lore. I think this is probably deliberate. White Diamond functions in the story as a kind of god figure, distant, cold, very powerful, ultimately revealed to be something more vulnerable and lonely than she appeared. Her arc isn't about backstory. Her arc is about being challenged by Steven and forced to reckon with the harm her system has caused. To do that arc properly, the show needed her to remain a bit mythic. If you give her a detailed origin, she becomes another character with motivations and history. By keeping her past blank, the show keeps her in the role of the system itself. Something that just exists, that everyone is born into, that has to be confronted on its own terms. That's a charitable reading, anyway. The less charitable reading is that the show ran out of time and there were a lot of plates spinning by the end, and White's backstory was one of the things that had to get sacrificed to keep the main emotional arcs working. Both readings are probably partly true. There's one more wrinkle worth mentioning. In future, after the events of the main series, White and the other diamonds are supposedly reformed. They're working on dismantling the Empire. They're trying to be better. But we don't really see what that looks like for White in particular. The other diamonds get little moments. Yellow and blue have a couple of appearances where you can see they're trying. But White is mostly off-screen, doing whatever a reformed cosmic empress does with her time. The show ends without ever really showing us whether her change of heart actually stuck. Which means if you want to be properly ambiguous about it, you could say that we don't really know what White Diamond was like before the rebellion, what she was like during it, what she was like after Pink supposedly died, or what she's like now. We have a few snapshots taken at significant moments. Everything else is a blank. That's a strange amount of unknown for the most powerful character in the show. But there she is, white as marble, vast as a moon, unknowable in the way that very old things tend to be. So while we're talking about powerful things sitting just out of sight, this feels like the right moment to bring up the giant fused gem that's currently inside the molten core of the Earth. Yes, that's a real thing. That's a real situation in the show as of the end of the run. There is, in canon, a sentient creature larger than the planet itself, sitting in a bubble at the center of the Earth, made up of millions of crushed and refused gem shards. It's called the Cluster. And it's just down there, the last time we saw it, getting on with its existence. Let me back up a bit, because the Cluster's whole deal takes some explaining. In the Steven Universe, gems can be killed. Properly killed, I mean. Their physical bodies are made of light, projected from a gemstone, so if you damage the body, they can usually reform. That's standard. But if you damage the gemstone itself, really break it, crack it open, smash it, then the gem inside is destroyed. That's called shattering. It's the gem equivalent of death. There's no coming back from it. What the show reveals around the second season is that during the rebellion on Earth, thousands and thousands of gems got shattered. Both sides took horrific losses. Most of the bodies were left where they fell or piled up in mass graves. The show calls strawberry battlefields, because the surviving giant weapons sit half buried in fields of strawberries now. Big sword in the dirt, strawberries growing around it. Strange landscape. After the rebellion, Homeworld decided that Earth was a write-off as a colony. Too messy, too damaged, full of rebels. So they cooked up a backup plan. They gathered up as many shards of shattered gems as they could find, both their own dead and the rebels' dead. And they buried them deep under the Earth's surface, and they fused them together, forcibly, into one massive creature. the idea was that the creature would slowly come together inside the planet. And once it had fully formed, it would emerge from the core, and the act of emerging would split the Earth apart. Geoweapon, they called it. Bioweapons attack life. Geoweapons attack rocks. The cluster was specifically designed to attack the planet itself. This was the major arc of seasons 2 and 3. Peridot reveals it. The crystal gems try to figure out how to stop it. Steven and Peridot eventually drill down to the core in a giant drilling machine and confront the thing in person. And then in an episode called Gem Drill, which aired in May 2016, the actual confrontation happens. What happens is not what anyone was expecting. Steven, instead of trying to fight the cluster, falls into a trance and connects with it psychically. He realizes that it isn't really a single creature with a single mind. It's millions of individual consciousnesses, each one fragmented, each one in pain, each one trying desperately to find the rest of itself. Imagine waking up and discovering that you're missing most of your body, and your body is scattered across the floor of a cave, and there are millions of other people in the same situation, and the only way you can think to feel whole again is to merge with all of them. That's the cluster. It's mass trauma made physical. Steven manages to convince it, gently, that it doesn't have to form, that it can be its own thing without taking the whole planet with it. And the cluster, with Steven's help, bubbles itself. The whole creature, all of it, encased in one massive bubble. Bubbling, by the way, is a thing gems can do. They can put a gemstone or another small object inside a sphere of energy, and it stays preserved in there until the bubble pops. The cluster bubbles its own enormous self, calms down, and stays quiet. That should be the end of it. And for a while it is, but the cluster doesn't go away. It's still there. Throughout the rest of the show, it's referenced occasionally. There's a great moment in the Season 5 episode Reunited, where Blue and Yellow Diamond turn up in their massive ships to ruin Garnet's wedding. And the cluster, sensing the threat, emerges briefly from the Earth to defend the wedding party. Just an arm at first, then enough of a torso to push the diamond ships back. It's protecting its friends. After the threat passes, it goes back into the Earth and bubbles itself again. And then in future, the show's epilogue, the cluster appears one more time. In an episode called I Am My Monster, Steven himself transforms into a giant pink monster because of accumulated trauma, and the cluster, apparently sensing him from below, comes up and holds him in its arms. Briefly, it disperses. Briefly, it's a comforting presence. And then it goes back down again. That's his last appearance. So here's what I keep getting stuck on. The cluster is still down there. As of the end of the show, that bubble is still inside the Earth. Inside it are millions of shattered gem consciousnesses. They have, collectively, decided not to form into a planet-killing weapon. But they haven't been healed. They haven't been re-individuated. They're still fused together in a way that wasn't their choice, made up of pieces of people who used to be other people. Yellow Diamond, in an episode of Future called Homeworld Bound, says that one of her new projects is going to be restoring as many of the shattered gems as she can. There's a whole storyline about gem shard restoration that gets introduced and then doesn't really go anywhere. We see one or two test cases. We don't see anyone tackle the cluster specifically. The show ends with Yellow's project barely started, which means the cluster, in canon, is still a giant traumatized mass fusion living in the planet's core, hopefully content, but not actually fixed, waiting for someone to come and sort it out properly. I find this such a strange, unresolved thread, not because the show should have necessarily explained it more. I think the metaphor of leaving it there, calmed but not cured, is actually quite powerful, but because it's the kind of thing that, in a more conventional show, would absolutely be the final season finale. The big climactic restoration of the cluster, Steven and Yellow Diamond, and the others working together to free all those consciousnesses. Big emotional moment. Maybe a song. Steven Universe didn't do that. The show was always more interested in interpersonal trauma than in cosmic plotting, and by the time Future rolled around, the focus had shifted to Steven's mental health and his transition into adulthood. The cluster became background. Important background, mind you, but background. It's the same energy as the chest and the lion's mane. Set up carefully, then quietly left for someone else to deal with. There's a smaller question buried inside this one that I think about sometimes. If the cluster's millions of individual gems fuse together, do those gems individually still have their own identities in there? Are they conscious as themselves, or have they melded into one collective mind? The show seems to suggest the answer changes over time. Early on, when the cluster is in pain, the consciousnesses are fragmented and reaching for each other. Later, after Steven calms it down, it speaks as a single unified voice, but what happens if Yellow Diamond does eventually pull them apart and restore them? Are they themselves again? Or have they become something else entirely while they were down there? The show doesn't say. It probably can't say, because the answer would be different depending on which gem you were asking, which is, in its own way, exactly the kind of half-answer Steven Universe specializes in. So that's where the cluster sits, Earth's core, inside a bubble, resting. The whole world's continuing to spin around it. Now, on a much smaller scale, but in the same emotional neighborhood, there's the question of Lion, specifically how Lion got to be Lion. I love Lion. I should say that up front. Lion is one of the best characters on Steven Universe by a long way, and he doesn't speak, he barely emotes, and he spends most episodes asleep on Steven's bed or on the beach. But he's one of those animal characters that ends up carrying enormous emotional weight for the show, partly because everyone else is so verbose and Lion's silence becomes its own statement. Here's what we know about him. He's a lion. He's pink. He's roughly the size of a normal lion, but he can warp from place to place by opening his mouth and roaring a portal into existence. He has a magical pocket dimension inside his mane, which we've already talked about. He understands human speech, can carry Steven on his back, and occasionally does things that suggest he's smarter than your average pet. He's been with Rose Quartz, presumably for hundreds of years before the show begins. He turns up in the desert in Season 1, attaches himself to Steven, and sticks around. The mystery of his origin doesn't get unpacked until pretty late in the show's run. Season 4 has an episode called Buddy's Book, which is a really lovely standalone episode where Steven and Connie find an old journal in a library. The journal belongs to a man called Buddy Budwick, an explorer from the 1700s. As Steven and Connie read, the episode plays out Buddy's adventures, and at one point, his travels take him into a desert. And in that desert, Buddy meets Rose Quartz. She's hanging out with a pride of lions. That's the detail that stops you in your tracks if you're paying attention. There were multiple lions. Rose had them as friends or pets or companions or something. They weren't pink. They were just regular lions. And Rose was apparently spending considerable time out there in the desert, away from the rest of the crystal gems, just living with these animals. Pearl, watching the episode play out through the journal, does a sort of double take. She didn't know about the lions. Rose had kept this whole part of her life private, even from her closest companion. Which is very Rose when you think about it. She had layers to her that nobody, not even the people who loved her most, ever fully saw. So that's the establishing shot. Hundreds of years ago, in a desert somewhere, there was a normal pride of lions and Rose Quartz was one of their friends. What happens next the show does not show us. At some point, we don't know when or how, one of those lions died. We don't know which one. We don't know what killed it. Old age is possible. Lions don't live very long. Predators, although lions don't tend to have many in a desert. Hunters, given the time period, also possible. Disease, injury. Whatever it was, it happened off-screen, hundreds of years before the show begins. And Rose, faced with the death of this lion she'd evidently grown attached to, did something she'd presumably never done before. She brought it back to life. We don't see this either. We never get a flashback of Rose Quartz crying over a dying lion. We never see the moment her grief converts itself into resurrection. We just have to infer that this is what happened, because the show eventually shows a similar process happening to a different character, and the parallel is the only explanation that makes sense. That character is Lars. Lars is a teenage human who works at the Big Donut in Beach City, He gets accidentally taken to Homeworld in the back half of the show, and during a fight with some Homeworld robots, he gets killed. Killed properly, hit his head against a rock and died killed. Steven, distraught, holds him and cries, and Steven's tears fall onto Lars's body. And Lars comes back, but he's different. His skin and hair have turned pink. He doesn't seem to need food or sleep the same way. He's functionally immortal now, the way Lion appears to be. And his hair, just like Lion's mane, contains a pocket dimension. They're connected in some way, the two of them. They share whatever weird metaphysical space Rose's tears opened up. So we can reverse engineer Lion's origin from this. Rose found a dying lion. Rose cried over the dying lion. The tears soaked into the lion. The lion came back, pink, with magical properties. Fundamentally changed, but still essentially itself. The show acknowledges this connection in the season 5 finale, Change Your Mind. Lars returns to Earth after his time in space. And there's a quiet moment where Lion and Lars meet for the first time. They look at each other, they sniff each other, they share what's pretty clearly a moment of mutual recognition between two beings who've been through the exact same impossible experience. Then they go their separate ways. The show doesn't underline it. It doesn't have anyone explain what's just happened. It trusts the audience to clock the parallel, which is lovely, but also leaves a fair bit unanswered. Like, for instance, what about the other lions? Buddy's journal showed multiple lions in the desert. If Rose was attached enough to one of them to bring it back from death, presumably she was attached to others too. What happened to them? Did they die one by one? Normal lion deaths over the course of decades? Was Rose just there for all of it, watching them go? Did she only bring back this particular one? And if so, why? Because she got better at controlling her powers? Because something was different about that specific lion? We don't know. There's also the question of what Lion remembers. He acts like a regular cat most of the time. He sleeps. He eats. He's particularly fond of Lion Liquors, which is a cat ice cream brand in the show. He gets jealous when Steven pays attention to other animals. All of this suggests a relatively normal animal mind, but he's also clearly aware of bigger things. He carries items in his mane that Rose entrusted to him. He understands when Steven needs to get somewhere. He responds to emotional cues in a way real lions don't. There's a theory that Lion is partly Rose, in some metaphysical sense. The argument goes that when Rose used her power to bring him back, she imparted something of herself into him, the same way she would later impart all of herself into Steven by giving birth. The tape, the sword, the bubbled friend in his mane, those are pieces of Rose's life she stored in a creature that was, in some sense, also her. I don't know if that's true canonically. The show flirts with the idea, but doesn't commit to it. What I find interesting is that nobody in the show ever sits down with Lion and asks him about it. Steven doesn't try to communicate with him about his origins. The crystal gems don't seem to know much about him either. He's just there, accepted, treated as a magical pet, rather than a witness to several centuries of Rose's life, which feels like a missed opportunity but also fits with how Steven Universe handles a lot of its mysteries. Characters tend to accept the strangeness of their world and not interrogate it too hard. There's one more thing about Lion that I want to mention before we move on, because it's the kind of detail that makes me oddly fond of him. He doesn't always come when Steven calls. He's not a fully obedient creature. He'll wander off. He'll sleep through emergencies. He'll show up at strange moments and demand affection and then leave again. He's a cat, fundamentally, in his temperament, even though he's got the body of a lion. That feels like an honest piece of writing. Whatever Rose did to him, however she resurrected him, she didn't change his basic nature. He's still a lion who likes naps, with a magical mane and an unanswered question or two in his past. Right then, let me walk you through one of the saddest rooms in Steven Universe because I think about it a lot, and the show only really uses it for 2 episodes before mostly forgetting it exists. It's a chamber on Pink Diamond's Zoo, which is a space station orbiting somewhere out in the galaxy. The zoo itself is its own whole thing. We'll get into the strange humans in captivity premise in a minute, but the room I'm specifically thinking about is in a quieter part of the station. It's pink. Soft pink. Low lit. With tall ceilings and pillars that look a bit like they're made of crystal. And floating up near the ceiling, dozens and dozens of them, possibly hundreds, are bubbles. Each bubble contains a single gemstone. Each gemstone is a rose quartz. That's the bubble room. And those rose quartzes have been up there for thousands of years. Here's the backstory you need. Rose Quartz, the character we know as Steven's mother, was actually Pink Diamond in disguise. That's a Season 5 revelation that recontextualizes the entire show. And it's one of the great twists in modern animated television, in my opinion. Pink Diamond, frustrated by the other diamonds refusing to take her seriously and unwilling to let her abandon Earth as a colony, invented a Rose Quartz alter ego, started a rebellion against herself, and eventually faked her own shattering to convince Homeworld to leave Earth alone. Pearl helped her do this. Almost nobody else knew the truth. The fallout, when Pink supposedly died, was vicious. Homeworld assumed Rose Quartz had killed Pink. They assumed all Rose Quartzes were therefore dangerous, since they'd been created by Pink and one of them had supposedly turned on her. Yellow Diamond's preferred response was to round up every Rose Quartz in the Empire and shatter them all. Just blanket destruction of the entire gem type. Blue Diamond didn't agree. Blue had loved Pink in a complicated maternal way, and shattering Pink's creations felt like erasing more of her. So Blue argued for an alternative. Bubble them. Preserve them. Keep them sealed away forever, but don't actually destroy them. And Yellow, despite some grumbling, eventually agreed. So the surviving Rose Quartzes, however many of them there were, got rounded up, poofed back into their gemstone forms, and sealed into bubbles in this room on the zoo. And they stayed there. The room first turns up in episodes called Gem Heist, and that will be all in Season 4. The crystal gems break into the zoo to rescue Greg, who's been kidnapped by Blue Diamond. And as they're sneaking around, they pass through this chamber. Steven looks up and sees all the bubbles. Pearl, because Pearl knew the truth all along, has to keep a straight face about why these gems are up here. She knows that the only Rose Quartz who ever did anything meaningful was Pink in disguise. The actual Rose Quartzes have spent thousands of years as prisoners for a crime none of them committed. That's the bit that lands hardest for me. None of them did it. There was no Rose Quartz uprising. There was no rebel Rose Quartz who shattered Pink. The whole premise on which Homeworld imprisoned them was a lie. And it was Pink Diamond's lie, the lie of the diamond who created them in the first place. They were locked up because of her, and they have no idea because they've been bubbled. When you bubble a gem, the gem stays preserved indefinitely, but it doesn't reform. It doesn't move. It doesn't experience anything in any way we'd recognize as far as the show suggests. It's like a particularly long sleep with no dreams. The Rose Quartzes have effectively skipped the last several millennia of history. And then, near the end of Steven Universe Future, in an episode called Rosebuds, 3 of them get unbubbled and come to Earth. Just 3. There's a sense in the episode that more of them have been freed, but the focus is on these 3 specifically. They show up at the beach house, and the situation is genuinely awkward, because Steven, who has Pink Diamond's gem inside him, is essentially their creator. They didn't ask to be made. They didn't ask to be bubbled. And they don't quite know how to relate to this teenage boy who looks vaguely like the version of their creator that the propaganda told them was a traitor. The episode is a lot. It packs a lot of identity processing into a short runtime. The 3 Rose Quartzes have very different reactions. One is enthusiastic about Earth and happy to be free. One is more reserved, almost shy. One is angry. Angry that they were locked up. Angry at Pink for what she did. Angry at being expected to just slot into a society they had no part in building. And the resolution, such as it is that they all get to choose what to do next. They can stay on Earth, they can go elsewhere, they're free to figure themselves out, which is fine as far as it goes. But the episode is 20-something minutes long, and there are at least 3 full character arcs being squashed into that runtime, and the show, which was on its very last legs at this point, with the network having made it clear there wouldn't be more, does what it can in the time available. Then the episode ends. What the show doesn't show us, and what I've been thinking about for years now, is what happened to the rest of them. The bubble room had a lot of rose quartzes in it. Loads of them. 3 is a fraction. Where did the others go? Were they all unbubbled? Are they still bubbled? Did they all come to Earth? Did they go to Homeworld? Did some of them choose to stay in their bubbles because waking up was too much? The closest thing to an answer I can find is that the show implies, generally, that all the bubbled rose quartzes have been freed by the time of future. There are background gems in Little Homeworld, the new gem-friendly settlement on Earth, who look like rose quartzes. So presumably some of them are out there, getting on with their lives, but we don't really see them. We don't get to know them. They become extras. There's a fun and slightly philosophical layer to all this that the show pokes at briefly. Because Pink Diamond made the rose quartzes, and Pink Diamond also made Steven by becoming part of him, the rose quartzes are technically Steven's siblings, or his cousins, or some other family relationship that doesn't quite have a name in human terms. They're related to him through their shared creator, and they were imprisoned because of decisions she made, and now they're here on Earth trying to figure out what they are now that the lie is over. I think this is one of those things the show set up because it understood the metaphor and wanted to plant the metaphor in the soil even if there wasn't time to fully grow it. The rose quartzes stand in for everyone Pink hurt by leaving, the gems she abandoned, the friends who mourned her, the strangers who got caught up in her lies. Spinel was one version of that. The bubbled rose quartzes are another, smaller version, and they get less screen time, but the resonance is the same. That's the room. That's the situation. As of the end of the show, the bubbles are mostly empty. The rose quartzes are out there somewhere, doing whatever they're doing, being themselves for the first time in thousands of years. We don't really know where they are now or what they made of any of it. The show set them free and then waved. Imagine being trapped inside a piece of glass, not symbolically, literally. Your physical form has been collapsed back into your gemstone, and your gemstone has been welded to the back of a mirror, and the mirror has been left on the floor of an abandoned warp pad on a planet that's about to be evacuated. You can sense things. You can hear voices when people are nearby, faintly through the glass. You can replay images on the surface of the mirror like a recording. You can do nothing else. You can't move, you can't speak, you can't form a body. You're just there, in the glass, on the floor, while the world goes on without you. That's where Lapis Lazuli starts the show. That's the situation she's been in for somewhere in the region of several millennia before Steven finds her in season 1. Lapis is one of my favorite characters in the show, and her backstory is one of the more genuinely haunting bits of the lore. She's a Lapis Lazuli, a kind of gem made for Blue Diamond's court, with the role of being a sort of reconnaissance and surveying gem. They have water powers, they can fly, they show people things. They're not soldiers. The version of Lapis we meet wasn't on Earth for the war. She wasn't a rebel. She wasn't a combatant. She was by all accounts just visiting. Earth was being colonized, and homeworld gems would come and go from the planet, and Lapis was one of those gems passing through during the colonization period, and she got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The episode that explains this is called Same Old World, in the 3rd season. Lapis tells Steven her story, and the way she tells it is very flat and resigned, which actually makes it land harder than if she'd been emotional about it. She was on Earth when the war broke out. She was trying to leave. And Bismuth, the same Bismuth we know now from the crystal gems, accidentally poofed her, mistaking her for a homeworld combatant. Bismuth has water powers herself, sort of, in that she's a builder who makes weapons. And presumably in the chaos of battle she didn't have time to ask whether the random Lapis she was fighting was a soldier or a tourist. Lapis got hit. Her body collapsed back into her gemstone, and that should have been the end of the story. Except it wasn't. Homeworld's forces recovered her gemstone, and because they were paranoid about crystal gem rebels, they assumed any random Lapis they found near a battle had to be a rebel sympathizer. So instead of just letting her reform, they bound her into a mirror, which is apparently a thing they could do and which seems to be a really specific and brutal form of imprisonment, and they kept her locked inside it for interrogation. They wanted information about Rose Quartz, about the rebels' positions, about the crystal gem's plans. Lapis didn't have any of that information. She wasn't a rebel. She'd been visiting. She was a tourist. The whole interrogation was based on a misunderstanding that nobody bothered to verify. And then, as if all of that wasn't enough, Homeworld lost the war. The Diamonds did the corruption blast thing. There's a separate mystery there we'll get to. And they fled the planet. In their hurry to leave, they dropped the mirror, or stepped on it, or knocked it about, and the Lapis's gem got cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but it was enough to leave her permanently damaged. They didn't notice. They didn't come back for her. They left her on the floor of the galaxy warp on a planet they'd just lost, and they never returned. Pearl found the mirror eventually, sometime over the next several thousand years. She didn't know there was anyone inside it. She thought it was just a recording device, a piece of gem technology that could play back images of historical events. She kept it. Eventually, in Season 1, she gave it to Steven so he could learn about gem history. And Steven, who has the kind of gentle attention that other people don't, started talking to the mirror as if it were a person. And the mirror started talking back, in fragments, in repeated phrases, in pieces of recorded audio from things people had said near it over the millennia, like a particularly haunted videotape. Eventually, Steven realizes there's a real consciousness in there. He pulls the gemstone out of the mirror shatters, Lapis reforms, and the first thing she does is escape, fly off, and try to get back to Homeworld using stolen ocean water as a sort of space elevator, because Earth has been her prison for the better part of a geological era, and she is done with it. Now, the show then goes on to give Lapis a big arc. She gets stuck on Earth, eventually fuses with Jasper into a deeply unhealthy fusion called malachite, fights herself out of that, befriends Peridot, lives in a barn, becomes a crystal gem, leaves, comes back, and ends up settling down in Little Homeworld by the time of Future. Properly heroic arc if you trace it from one end to the other. What the show doesn't really sit with, and what I keep going back to, is how long she was in the mirror as a conscious being. The show suggests she was aware in there, at least some of the time. She remembers things. She has memories of voices she heard while trapped. The fact that she could communicate with Steven through repeated recordings means she was paying attention enough to gather the materials for those recordings. So she was, in some sense, alive in there for thousands of years, in a state of complete sensory deprivation broken only by occasional voices. That's a kind of trauma the show is gentle about depicting but doesn't fully unpack. Lapis is, by the end of the show, mostly okay. She's got friends, she's got a settled life, she paints sometimes, she's got Peridot, who is one of the most genuinely lovely characters in the whole series, but she also struggles visibly with anything that reminds her of being trapped. There's an episode where she becomes a leader for two newly arrived Lapises, and finds she can't quite handle their admiration of her hardness. She storms off. The show acknowledges that the wound is still there, but it doesn't dig into it. A small thing I like, by the way. The mirror itself has an 8-pointed star symbol etched into it. The star isn't decorative. It appears to be a binding symbol of some kind. Some fans have pointed out that this resembles the Khatam Suleiman, the seal of Solomon, which in a few different mythological traditions is a symbol used to bind jinn or trap spirits. I don't know if Rebecca Sugar specifically had that in mind, but it's the kind of touch you'd expect from her. The whole show has these little folkloric undertones to it, and a mirror that traps consciousness using an 8-pointed star is right in that tradition. The piece that doesn't get resolved in terms of Lapis's relationships is the Peridot thing. By the end of Future, the show is heavily implying that Lapis and Peridot are together, in some kind of romantic or close emotional capacity. They live near each other, they're constantly hanging out, they've got that energy, but the show never explicitly confirms it. They never fuse, even though every other major couple on the show ends up fusing as a kind of declaration. Garnet is a fusion, obviously. Ruby and Sapphire get married. Steven and Connie make Stevani. Pearl and Amethyst make Opal. The diamonds eventually fuse together as a healing gesture, but Lapis and Peridot never do. The reason given in the show, I think, is that Lapis still doesn't trust fusion. Her experience as Malachite was so bad that she's wary of merging her consciousness with anyone, even someone she loves. Which is fair. That's a real character beat. But it does mean that the natural narrative endpoint of their relationship just sits there, never reached. Future ends without telling us if they ever got there. The whole pairing gets the same treatment as everyone else on this list. Acknowledged, honored, not resolved. So that's the mirror business. Lapis is fine. Lapis is more than fine. She's got a life, she's got people who love her, she's got water powers that can shift entire oceans. But the question of what those years inside the glass did to her, what kind of permanent shape they left in her, is something the show flags and then steps around. Which feels right, honestly. Some things you don't unpick. You just leave them be. Picture two pearls standing in the same room. One is the pearl we know. Slim, anxious, tightly composed. The pearl who's been part of the crystal gems for thousands of years. The other one is pink, with a cracked eye and a bun, behaving like she's not entirely sure how to exist now that nobody's holding her strings. Both of them belong to Pink Diamond at different times. Both of them have served the same diamond. They are technically each other's predecessor and successor, separated by quite a lot of years and a really significant amount of trauma. And the show puts them in the same room and says, essentially, here you go, work this out. The other pearl is called Pink Pearl. The Crewniverse, that's what the production team called themselves, nicknamed her Volleyball during production. Steven, when he meets her, also ends up calling her Volleyball, partly to distinguish her from the Crystal Gems Pearl, and partly because the moment of christening is connected to a literal volleyball that hits him in the head. It's a bit of a daft name for a deeply tragic character, but it stuck. Here's the situation, as the show eventually lays it out. Pink Diamond, way back when, before Earth, before the rebellion, before she invented her Rose Quartz alter ego, was given a pearl. That's standard. Diamonds get pearls. Pearls are servants made to order. Pink's pearl, the original one, was the pink one. The two of them were close. We see flashbacks of them together, and there's a real sense that Pink Pearl loved Pink Diamond in the uncritical, devoted way that pearls love their diamonds. At some point, Pink Diamond had a tantrum. We don't see exactly what triggered it, but we know it was a big one. Pink had a habit of throwing fits when things didn't go her way. She was the youngest diamond, treated like a child by the others, and she would lash out emotionally when she didn't feel taken seriously. This particular tantrum was so intense that it physically damaged Pink Pearl, who was nearby, cracked her eye, caused real lasting injury, the kind that doesn't heal even after a gem reforms. This is established in a future episode literally called Volleyball, which aired in 2020 and finally explained where Pink Pearl's scar came from. White Diamond, watching all this from above, decided that Pink had to be punished. White's chosen punishment was to take Pink Pearl away from Pink. Confiscate her, essentially. And then, this is the part that makes the whole thing properly horrible. White Diamond took the cracked pearl into her own service, but not as a normal pearl. She used her as a kind of remote-controlled puppet. White has the ability to mind-control gems, and she used Pink Pearl as her own avatar, broadcasting her own thoughts through Pink Pearl's body, while Pink Pearl herself remained dormant inside her own head for around 8,000 years. That's the full timeline, more or less. Pink loses her pearl. White takes the pearl as a punishment trophy. The pearl spends all that time as a meat puppet for the most powerful diamond in the galaxy, with no agency of her own, no thoughts of her own that she can act on, just White's voice using her body. And Pink, meanwhile, is given a new pearl as a sort of consolation prize, the pearl we know, the one who eventually becomes a crystal gem. Our pearl was made approximately 11,000 years ago, custom ordered for Pink. The showrunner, Joe Johnston, confirmed this in an interview, which is good because for a long time fans had a popular theory that our pearl had originally belonged to White Diamond and had been swapped over to Pink. The dream sequence the show used to set up the reveal was deliberately ambiguous on this point. But no, our Pearl was always Pink's. She was just a replacement. So when Pink Pearl finally gets freed in the season 5 finale, White's mind control breaks when Steven gets through to White emotionally, the two Pearls end up in the same place, and they have to figure out what to do with each other. Pink Pearl spent millennia being someone else's voice. Our Pearl spent millennia in the rebellion, then in mourning, then helping raise Steven. They're versions of each other from very different lives. The show handles this with a lot of care, but it also doesn't quite resolve it. Pink Pearl, freed from White's control, is gentle, and a bit lost and clearly still in love with Pink Diamond, who no longer exists. Our Pearl, who has done the heavy work of grieving Rose for years already, looks at Pink Pearl with something like pity and frustration. There's an episode where they have a kind of confrontation, and Pink Pearl's affection for Pink, naive, uncomplicated, untouched by everything that happened after, reads as almost insulting to our Pearl, who's lived through what Pink actually did. They don't fight, but they also don't really become friends. By the end of Future, Pink Pearl has moved into a place called the Reef, which is where pearls go to be repaired and refurbished. She's settled in there, as far as we can tell. Our Pearl lives on Earth. They occasionally interact, but the show doesn't give them a deep relationship. They're more like two people who used to date the same person and now they have to share custody of the memory. There's a fun behind-the-scenes detail I want to mention here. Rebecca Sugar's official book, Steven Universe End of an Era, includes a document called the Top Secret Visual Timeline, which is the internal mythology she mapped out for the show in 2016. And in that timeline, Pink Pearl's story is slightly different. In that earlier draft, Pink Pearl wasn't taken away by White, she was destroyed. The idea was that Pink Pearl, watching Pink suffer at the hands of the other diamonds, finally snapped one day and shouted at White, Yellow, and Blue about how cruel they were being. And the three of them, flabbergasted at being scolded by a Pearl, destroyed her on the spot. The version that ended up in the show softened that. Pink Pearl wasn't destroyed. She was taken into White's service, mind-controlled, preserved in body, if not in spirit. Both versions are dark. The show's version is arguably darker, actually, because it's a long, slow, ongoing erasure rather than a quick death. What you end up with is a character whose backstory has two slightly different shapes depending on which canonical material you're consulting. The show says one thing, the supplementary book says another. Both are technically valid, depending on how you weight them. The piece I really wonder about is what Pink Pearl's interior life was like during those millennia. She was conscious, presumably, in some form, while White was using her body. We don't see how that worked. Was she watching, helpless, while her own hands did what White wanted? Was she dormant, asleep, dreamless? Was she sometimes herself and sometimes not? The show doesn't say, and it would be a properly bleak thing to dramatize, so it's probably for the best that it doesn't. What the show does establish is that after she's freed, she's basically herself again. The cracked eye is still there as a permanent injury. Her colors are pink again instead of monochrome. She remembers pink, remembers the garden, remembers being in service. But she's also missing 8,000 years that she was alive for and didn't get to be a person during. That's a lot of lost time. I think about this when I rewatch the show. Two pearls, separated by an enormous amount of suffering. Both of them, in some sense, daughters of the same neglectful parent figure. The show couldn't really give them a clean resolution because there isn't one. The damage was already done. The best they could do was acknowledge each other and keep going, right? Switching gears a bit because not every unresolved thread in Steven Universe is heartbreaking. Some of them are just funny. And the funniest one, in my opinion, is what happened to the Ruby Squad. You probably remember Eyeball. She's the small, angry red gem with one eye in the center of her face, who Steven shares an airlock with in Season 3, and who tries to stab him with a knife after finding out his mother killed her diamond. Memorable character. Permanently angry. Voiced with a really specific kind of bitter intensity. She's a recurring presence in the show, popping up here and there, getting more and more bitter every time she appears. What people sometimes forget is that Eyeball didn't come alone. The Ruby Squad arrived on Earth as a unit. There were 5 of them. Eyeball, who I've already mentioned, plus Doc, Army, Leggy, and Navy. They were all rubies, short, red, identical in basic body type, but distinguished by personality and slightly different gem placements. They turned up in Season 3 on a mission for Yellow Diamond looking for Jasper, who had gone missing on Earth. The thing is, the crystal gems didn't have Jasper at the time. Jasper had been corrupted and was off doing her own thing. So the rubies were looking for someone the gems couldn't help them find. And rather than admitting this and risking the rubies reporting back to Yellow Diamond, the crystal gems pulled a trick. They convinced the rubies that Jasper had gone to Neptune. Just made it up. Said, yes, we know Jasper, she's on Neptune, you should go check. And the rubies, who weren't the brightest, fell for it. They got back in their tiny hand-shaped spaceship and flew off into the solar system in search of a fellow gem who was, in fact, very much not on Neptune. That's the trick. That's the story. That should have been the end of the Ruby Squad's involvement in the show. 5 small angry red gems puttering off into space on a wild goose chase. A bit later in Season 3, the rubies came back. They'd presumably gone to Neptune, found nothing, and returned to Earth. And they were now suspicious. They knew they'd been lied to. They started causing problems. And in an episode called Bubbled, things escalated to the point where Steven ended up in space with the rubies on a small ship, with Eyeball trying to murder him. The other rubies were elsewhere on the ship, not part of the immediate confrontation. Steven, seeing no other option, opened the airlock and ejected himself and the rubies into space. And that, more or less, is the last meaningful moment any of the original Ruby Squad gets in the show. Eyeball survives. She shows up later having been picked up by a passing ship, full of stories about how she watched Steven die, and was completely wrong about that. She becomes a recurring minor antagonist. In future, she gets fused with Aquamarine into a vindictive little fusion called Bluebird Azurite, who has one episode dedicated to her ineffective revenge attempts. So Eyeball is accounted for. The other 4 rubies are not: Doc, Army, Leggy, and Navy. The show essentially loses track of them. Navy briefly returns later in the original series in a manipulative arc where she pretends to want to be a crystal gem, then betrays them and steals a handship. After that, none of the original rubies appear again as a unit. We don't see them on Homeworld during the various Homeworld set episodes. We don't see them in Era 3 during Future. They're just not there. I find this genuinely funny in a slightly cosmic way, because if you take the show's canon at face value, there's a reasonable possibility that there's still a small cluster of rubies floating somewhere in deep space, drifting along, having no idea what's happened back home. The show has Yellow Diamond as a relatively important figure throughout, and she's surrounded by pearls and citrines and various other gems, but the original rubies that worked under her, the squad that got sent to Earth, never reappear. Maybe they got picked up, maybe they didn't. Maybe they're still out there. There's a real practical question buried in this, which is how gems even get back from being stranded in deep space. The show doesn't really address this consistently. Lapis can fly home using water from her own gem, which she demonstrates in the first season. Lars and the Off-Colors steal a series of ships and use them to travel between systems. Most other gems seem to need transportation provided. They don't generate matter. They can't conjure a ship. So if you get launched into space without a ship, your options are limited. You wait for someone to find you, or you don't. Eyeball got found eventually. All got found. Whoever found her presumably had access to deep space scanners and was looking for stranded gems. Maybe they found the others too, off-screen, and just nobody bothered to mention it. Or maybe Eyeball was the only one anyone bothered with. And the other 4 are still out there 4 small specks of red drifting through the asteroid belt or further out, periodically emerging from their gems to look around, see nothing, and go back to dormancy. I want to say one thing about this in defense of the show, which is that animation is hard. Every time you bring back a minor character, somebody has to draw them. 5 rubies with 5 distinct designs requires 5 model sheets, 5 voice actors, 5 sets of animation reference. And Steven Universe was made under absolutely brutal time pressure for most of its run. So when characters disappear from the show, sometimes it's a creative choice and sometimes it's just because the next 20 episodes had other priorities and a recurring squad of minor antagonists wasn't going to fit. I have a lot of sympathy for that, but it does mean that the world of the show, taken on its own terms, has a lot of these dangling threads. People who got dropped, scenes that didn't quite resolve, recurring characters who turned out to only recur for a season and then quietly faded. If you're the sort of person who likes worlds to feel populated and lived in, all of this actually adds something. The galaxy is a big place. Not everyone we meet is going to come back. Some of them are just going to drift. There's a small adjacent thread I want to mention while we're on this. The Off-Colors, the group of misfit gems who Lars meets on Homeworld late in the show, have a similarly loose ending. They're a group of social outcasts, gems who were considered defective or unusual, who were going to be shattered if they got caught, and who hid in an old kindergarten until Lars rallied them. They become space pirates eventually. They steal a ship from a high-ranking gem called Emerald and fly around having adventures. We get one episode set on their ship called Lars of the Stars, and then they more or less vanish from the main narrative. They turn up again briefly in Change Your Mind to deliver Lars back to Earth, and then again briefly in a future episode called Little Graduation, where they decide to go back to space and resume their adventures. What the show never tells us is what those adventures involve. Lars is captain of a ship called the Sun Incinerator, with a fusion called Rhodonite as his strategist, conjoined twins called the Rutile Twins as his pilots, and various other off-colors as his crew. They're being chased by Emerald, the gem they stole the ship from. They have presumably a full ongoing space adventure happening just off the edge of the show. Steven Universe could have been a different show that focused on those adventures. It chose not to, which is fine. But it does leave a whole rich corner of the universe more or less undocumented. So the rubies are out there somewhere. The off-colors are out there somewhere. Emerald is presumably still chasing the off-colors. There's a lot of incidental life happening past the edges of what the camera shows us. And the show is fine with that. Beach City stays the focus. Everyone else gets on with whatever they're doing. There's a moment near the end of Steven Universe Future that I genuinely don't know what to do with, even after several rewatches. It's the moment Jasper kneels. She's just been shattered and put back together. Steven has done both of those things. He shattered her by accident during a sparring fight, then panicked, gathered up her pieces, and managed to repair her in his bathroom, using bottled samples of the diamond's essences and his own tears. She reformed. She looked at him. And then, instead of being angry, instead of trying to fight him, instead of any of the things you would expect from Jasper specifically, she dropped to one knee and said, "I bow to your strength, my diamond." That's the moment. That's the closest thing the show ever gets to a Jasper resolution. And it's not really a resolution at all. It's the start of something the show never quite picks back up. Let me back up. Jasper is one of the most consistent antagonists in Steven Universe. She turns up in Season 2, sent to Earth by Yellow Diamond as an enforcer to retrieve a few crystal gems for trial. She's a giant orange quartz, made on Earth during the colonization period, all muscle and aggression and pride. She's voiced by Kimberly Brooks with this really committed snarl. From her first scene, she's intimidating in a way the show hadn't quite shown before. Physically, dangerous, ideologically certain, and absolutely uninterested in being talked down. Her arc across the original series is pretty bleak when you trace it from start to finish. She fights Steven, gets defeated, ends up stranded on Earth, She fuses with Lapis into a deeply unhealthy combined being called Malachite, who is fundamentally two people locked in a domestic abuse cycle. Lapis traps the fusion at the bottom of the ocean to keep Jasper contained, but Jasper experiences it as a kind of horrifying captivity. When they finally separate, Jasper is broken. She becomes obsessed with finding power and meaning, starts gathering corrupted gems to form an army, and eventually, in desperation, fuses with one of the corrupted gems and becomes corrupted herself. I should explain corruption briefly because it's its own thing in the show. At the end of the rebellion, the Diamonds did a final attack on Earth, a kind of cosmic sound wave, sometimes called the corrupting light, that hit every gem on the planet. It was meant to destroy the crystal gems, but it ended up affecting almost every gem still on Earth, friend or foe, turning them into mindless, monstrous versions of themselves. Most of the corrupted gems we see throughout the show are the survivors of that attack, twisted into beast forms, unable to remember who they were. The crystal gems spend most of the show containing them in bubbles and trying to figure out how to heal them. Jasper, by getting herself corrupted in Season 3, basically ends up in the same condition. She becomes a beast, she gets bubbled, she stays that way until the Season 5 finale, when Steven and the Diamonds, together, heal all the corrupted gems at once. So Jasper comes back. She remembers herself, she walks out of the temple, a free, healed, but very damaged person. And here's where Future picks her up. By the time of the epilogue series, all the other healed gems have integrated into Little Homeworld, the new mixed community Steven has set up on Earth. They're going to school. They're learning how to live among humans. They're getting on with their lives. Jasper isn't doing any of that. She lives alone in a cave in the woods near Beach City. She's set up a primitive camp. She's training. Every day. For some battle she hasn't quite specified. She's not particularly hostile, but she's not part of the group either. She's just out there in the trees, brooding. In an episode called Fragments, which aired in March 2020, Steven goes to find her. He's having a really bad time mentally. He's losing control of his powers. He's lashing out at the people who love him. He doesn't want to be around the crystal gems because he keeps hurting them. So he goes to Jasper, reasoning, in a sort of confused teenage way that she might understand him, that she's the only one who's seen him angry and who won't be horrified by it. Jasper takes him in, and then she trains him. The training is brutal. She makes him climb mountains carrying boulders, then try to shatter the boulders with his fists. She makes him sleep outside. She makes him fight her. The whole point, from Jasper's perspective, is to teach him to channel his rage into power, the way Quartz soldiers are supposed to. After 3 days, they spar properly, and Steven, full of accumulated rage, generates a giant wall of pink spikes and slams them down on Jasper. Her body is destroyed. Her gem is shattered. It's worth pausing on that for a second. Steven, the protagonist of this nominally peaceful coming-of-age cartoon, has just done the gem equivalent of murder. The thing he spent his whole life refusing to do. The thing his mother arguably did to start the rebellion. He's done it. He panics. He scoops up the pieces of Jasper's gem. He runs home. He locks himself in the bathroom. He pours the bottled diamond essences over the shards, adds his own tears, and somehow it works. The gem reforms, Jasper comes back, and she kneels. And she calls him her diamond. What that moment means is the part the show doesn't quite tell us. On the surface, Jasper is responding to a demonstration of overwhelming power the way a Quartz soldier is meant to. She has now seen Steven's strength. She has been physically destroyed by it. And she has decided that he is therefore worthy of her loyalty. That's a homeworld response. That's the system she was created in. That's how she was designed to respond to a diamond. But the show, throughout, has been arguing that those homeworld systems are exactly what need to be dismantled. The whole rebellion was about gems being able to choose their own roles. Steven himself has built his entire moral framework around not winning loyalty through force. And here he is, having won Jasper's loyalty entirely through force. And the show frames it as a nightmare. Steven looks horrified. He doesn't want this. He's been turned into the thing he was raised not to be. In Future's actual final episode, called The Future, Jasper has moved to a little homeworld. She's chosen a hut. She's still calling Steven her diamond. He's leaving Earth to travel the country, and she crashes through her own walls to find him. Ask if he wants her to come along and accept his answer when he says no. And then she goes back to her hut. That's the last we see of her. What I find genuinely difficult about this is that Jasper isn't redeemed in any meaningful sense. She hasn't decided that the crystal gems were right all along. She hasn't disavowed her old loyalty to Yellow Diamond. She's just transferred her devotion from Yellow to Steven. The mechanism of her loyalty, recognizing power and serving it, is unchanged. What's changed is the target. That's not redemption, that's reassignment. And the show, in the final episode, looks at this and acknowledges it without resolving it. Jasper hasn't healed. She's still the same gem who hated and feared the wrong things. Just now she fears Steven instead of fearing the rebellion. And Steven, who is supposed to be the moral center of all this, is leaving without having helped her in any deeper way. It's the loose end I think about most, honestly. Because every other antagonist on the show gets a path to actual integration. Peridot becomes a sweet, weird scientist who lives in a barn. Lopez becomes a quiet artist with a friend group. Bismuth becomes a teacher at a little homeschool. Even the diamonds themselves do the work of trying to be different, even if we don't see most of it. Jasper just sits in her cave calling Steven her diamond, waiting for orders that are never going to come. Maybe that's the show being honest. Maybe some people don't get redemption arcs. Maybe some wounds don't close. Maybe the most you can hope for with someone like Jasper is that they don't actively make things worse. That's a real and somewhat grim observation about how change works, and the show was never afraid of being grim when it had to be. But it's also a thread the writers visibly didn't have time to fully address. Future was 20 episodes. Jasper got a couple. There's a version of this show that runs for 30 more episodes and gets her properly through to a healthier place. We just don't have that version. After all that, here's a smaller one. Properly small. Domestic in scale, no cosmic stakes, no shattered consciousnesses, no millennia of imprisonment. Just a phone number written on a piece of paper, and a Pearl who didn't know what to do with it. The episode is called Last One Out of Beach City, and it aired in the 4th season in 2017. The setup is sweet. Pearl, Amethyst, and Steven are going to a rock concert in another town. Pearl, who is a gem who has spent thousands of years in a state of mournful longing for Rose Quartz, is trying to be a bit more open to new experiences. She's wearing a leather jacket. She's driving a car. She's attempting, in her own particular way, to be cool. They stop at the Big Donut for snacks before heading out, and a girl walks in. The girl has shoulder-length hair dyed pink. She's wearing a crop top with some kind of animal design. She's got piercings, sunglasses pushed up on her head. The general aesthetic of someone who knows what subgenre of punk they prefer. She's gorgeous, and she looks vaguely like Rose Quartz, which is the bit Pearl notices first. Pearl is, instantly, completely undone. This is one of the loveliest things the show ever did. The whole episode treats Pearl's crush as a legitimate, emotional event without making fun of her for it. She fumbles. She knocks over a stack of cups. She drives badly. She runs a red light. The girl drives off on a motorcycle, and Pearl spends the rest of the episode trying not to think about her. Steven and Amethyst, who can both see what's happening, do that very particular thing teenagers and friends do. When they spot you have a crush, they tease, but they also help. The episode ends at the rock concert. Pearl has been miserable about her own awkwardness all episode, and the girl turns up in the audience. And Pearl, taking a deep breath, walks over and starts a conversation with her. We don't actually hear the conversation. The show cuts away. We come back to it after, with Pearl walking up to Steven and Amethyst and explaining that the girl gave her a piece of paper. The paper has numbers on it. Pearl, who has lived for several thousand years and has fought in interplanetary wars, does not know what these numbers mean. Steven gently explains that this is a phone number, that the girl has given Pearl her phone number, that this is a thing humans do when they want you to call them. And Pearl turns blue, because Pearl is a gem and gems' faces flush blue when they're embarrassed. And that's the credits. The girl is credited as Mystery Girl. The piece of paper, in close-up, has just an initial S written next to the number. She doesn't get a real name, not in this episode, not in any episode after. The show buys Pearl a mobile phone the next time we see her. There's an episode called A Single Pale Rose in season 5, where Steven goes inside Pearl's gem to find her phone and ends up in the equivalent of her memory palace, where the phone is buried under a lot of other stuff, and the whole experience is genuinely unsettling. But the phone exists. Pearl has it. Whether or not she ever called the number on the piece of paper is the question. The show never tells us. There's one more appearance of Mystery Girl. An episode called The Big Show in season 5 has Steven filming a documentary about a band Sadie has joined, and at one of the band's concerts, Mystery Girl is briefly visible in the audience. She's there. She doesn't speak. She doesn't interact with Pearl. The shot just confirms she still exists in the world of the show. That's it. That's her last appearance. End of series, end of future. Nothing more. You can read this a few different ways depending on how generous you want to be. The first reading is that Pearl did call her, they went on a date or two, it didn't quite click, and they parted ways amicably. The Mystery Girl appearance in The Big Show, at a concert, where Pearl is also presumably nearby, supports this. They're in the same room and there's no drama. They've already had whatever happened between them, and it's over and they're fine. The second reading is that Pearl never called. That she got home from the concert, looked at the piece of paper, panicked about it, and quietly put it in a drawer. That she's the kind of gem who can build up the courage for a single brave act and then not follow through on it. The Mystery Girl appearance in this reading is just bittersweet. Pearl in one part of the room, the girl in another, the connection that almost happened never having happened. The third reading, and this is the one that some fans hold on to, is that something more interesting happens between Pearl and Bismuth in future. The two of them are very visibly close in those later episodes. There's a kind of comfortable old friend energy between them that some viewers read as romantic. Bismuth, in this reading, is where Pearl actually ends up. And the Mystery Girl thing was a brief moment of trying to move on that didn't lead anywhere. Which is a perfectly legitimate way to depict moving on, by the way. Not every moment of being brave needs to lead to a relationship. Sometimes you just need to know you can get a phone number. The show, characteristically, doesn't tell us which of these is right. Could be any of them. Could be a fourth thing none of us have thought of. There's a fun behind the scenes detail I want to share, because it's the kind of thing only fans of the show would care about, and I count myself in that category. The storyboard artist who designed Mystery Girl, Jessie Zook, said in interviews that they were calling her Sheena internally, a reference to the Ramones song, Sheena is a punk rocker. Her piercings were inspired by their own World of Warcraft character. Her phone number, which is briefly visible on the paper, is 301-557-0189. The 555 prefix is the standard fictional phone number prefix used in American TV. It's a pre-cleared range so production companies don't accidentally give out a real person's number. The 89 at the end is Zook's birth year. So the character has all this care and texture put into her, and then she basically vanishes from the show. Which is a mood, honestly. Sometimes you put a lot of effort into a character who's only meant to be there for one episode, and then you let them go. Real life is full of people like that. People you met once who made an impression, who you never saw again. That's not a failure of storytelling, that's just how time works. I genuinely don't mind the lack of resolution on this one. Some things are better as questions. The pink-haired girl on a motorcycle, riding away from the diner with an unspoken understanding between her and Pearl that neither of them can quite articulate. That's a complete image. Whatever happened next is none of our business, really. Right then. Last big one. Let me tell you what we know about the rebellion, and then let me tell you what we don't. Because the gap between those two things is genuinely enormous. What we know is mostly the beginning and the end. We know that Pink Diamond, frustrated with being denied a meaningful role and increasingly attached to Earth, decided to invent the Rose Quartz alter ego and start a fake war against herself. We know this happened a bit over 5,000 years ago. We know that the rebellion lasted according to the show's own dialogue, around 1,000 years. We know it ended with the other diamonds, yellow, blue, and presumably white, performing a coordinated attack called the Corrupting Light, which we touched on earlier when we were talking about Jasper. The light hit everyone left on Earth and turned almost all of them into corrupted gems. Only Rose, Pearl, Garnet, and Bismuth survived intact, because Rose's shield could deflect the attack. So that's a beginning, that's an end. That's roughly 10 centuries between them. And the show, across about 180 episodes, gives us only a handful of moments from anywhere in that long stretch. Let me list what we get. The Sky Arena scene from the episode The Answer, which shows Ruby and Sapphire accidentally fusing into Garnet for the first time on Earth around 5752 years ago. That's a single afternoon's worth of events, depicted in detail. Then we get the Strawberry Battlefield, which is a present-day location the Crystal Gems sometimes visit, the site of one of the Rebellion's biggest battles, now overgrown with strawberry plants and full of ruined weapons. Then we get the moment of Bismuth being bubbled, after she presented her breaking point weapon to Rose. Then we get the moment of Pink Diamond's fake shattering. Then we get the Corrupting Light at the end. That's it. Maybe 4 or 5 distinct moments from a war that lasted longer than human civilization has existed. What we don't get is, well, the war, the actual fighting, the strategy, the lulls, the moments of doubt, the months between battles, when nothing is happening and everyone has to live with each other. The show treats the rebellion as something that happened, established it as a backdrop, and then moves on with its character work, which is a perfectly defensible storytelling choice. Steven Universe was never going to be a war story. It was a character drama using a war as the backstory that shaped its main characters. So you don't necessarily need the middle, but the middle's absence creates a lot of unanswered questions, which is what we're here for. How big was the Crystal Gems army? We don't really know. Bismuth, who was there, talks about other bismuths, though she also occasionally uses the term in ways that could be metaphorical. She says she once took down battalions of quartz soldiers alongside Garnet. Battalions, plural. Quartz battalions are not small, so at some point in the rebellion, the Crystal Gems were facing armies large enough to be organized into battalions, which means the Crystal Gems themselves were also a substantial force. We just never see that force. The closest we get is a single shot in the Strawberry Battlefield. The visual is full of huge half-buried weapons, pink swords, blue gauntlets, all sized for gems much larger than the named characters. There are gem types in the show that are much bigger than quartzes. The Rotal twins are roughly pearl-sized, but other types we glimpse on Homeworld are giants. Whoever was fighting in the Rebellion's later years included gems many times the size of anyone we ever meet by name. The battlefield is, in effect, a graveyard for participants we never got to know. Some of those participants we know from the Season 3 reveal ended up as part of the cluster. Their shards, picked up after the battle, fused into the giant geological weapon at the Earth's core. So if you're keeping track, the millions of consciousnesses inside that bubble in the planet's core are mostly the dead from this rebellion. They were soldiers once, on both sides. They got broken into pieces, scattered around battlefields, swept up and packaged into a weapon. That's the actual scale of what happened. The show, when it does reference all this, tends to do so through the survivor's grief. Garnet and Pearl visit the Strawberry Battlefield, and you can see in their body language that they remember it. Bismuth, when she's first unbubbled in Season 3, breaks down crying when she finds out how it ended. There's an episode called The Trial, which features a defending Zircon, laying out, very forensically, the full strangeness of how Pink Diamond was supposedly shattered, pointing out that Pink had agates and sapphires and her own pearl around her, and that there's no way an unauthorized Rose Quartz could have just walked through them all. That argument turns out to be the thread that unravels the whole reveal of Pink being Rose. But it's also a hint of what the war actually looked like, with all these bureaucratic layers of court protection that the show never really shows in operation. Here's a question I can't quite shake. The crystal gems are described as a movement, a faction with followers, a real army. We see 4 of them as the original survivors, and lapis is added later, and so on. But where are the crystal gem statues, the propaganda, the cultural artifacts, the songs, the leaders other than Rose? Movements that last that long generate a lot of stuff. We don't really see any of that. The Strawberry Battlefield is a graveyard, not a museum. Rose's fountain exists, but is mostly a healing site. There's no crystal gem equivalent of the Sky Arena, no monument to the dead, no preserved letters or banners. You could argue the diamonds destroyed all that as part of suppressing the rebellion. That's plausible. The corrupting light was a planet-wide attack, and a lot of culture would have been destroyed alongside everyone else. But you'd expect some remnants. The show is full of ancient gem ruins, temples, control rooms, observation decks. We see homeworld architecture surviving on Earth in many forms. We just don't see crystal gem architecture, except for Rose's personal stuff. It's almost as if the rebellion never had time to build anything of its own before it ended. Which might be the point, actually. Maybe the rebellion was always more of a failed last stand than a triumphant uprising. Pink Diamond didn't really intend to win. She intended to make Earth too costly to colonize, to convince Homeworld to give up. The actual outcome was that she faked her own death. The other diamonds responded with the corrupting light, and most of the surviving rebels were turned into beasts. That's not the arc of a successful revolution. That's a tragedy. And maybe the show, by not depicting the heroic middle of the war, is being honest about what it was. There was no glorious phase, there was just suffering with a few bright moments, Ruby and Sapphire forming Garnet, Bismuth crafting weapons, soldiers finding each other in the chaos and falling in love. Those are the moments the show preserves, because those are the moments that mattered to the people who survived. There's one specific thing I keep meaning to mention, which is the question of whether Bismuth was the only Bismuth. She talks like she might have been. Bismuth as a gem type is a builder, and they were involved in constructing homeworld colonies. The implication is that they were a relatively common type. But our Bismuth doesn't seem to know any others personally, and she never references any other Bismuth as someone she misses. So either there were others, all of whom were lost in the rebellion or the corrupting light, or she really is genuinely the only one of her kind. The show doesn't clarify. There's also the question of who actually led the rebellion's military. Rose Quartz was the figurehead, the inspiration, the rallying point. But she was also Pink Diamond, sneaking out to play soldier without anyone knowing. Day to day, somebody must have been making the actual tactical decisions. Pearl, presumably. Garnet, definitely. Bismuth, in some capacity. But the chain of command is never really detailed. It's a guerrilla resistance with a diamond at the top who's secretly running both sides of the war. That's an extraordinarily strange organizational structure, and the show treats it as just a thing that was, rather than something to interrogate. What I take from all this, after a few rewatches, is that the show was never trying to give us the full history. It was trying to give us the emotional aftermath. The rebellion is the dark backdrop against which the present-day characters figure out who they are. We don't need every battle, we need the Strawberry Battlefield as a tone, we need the cluster as a consequence, we need Bismuth as a perspective on the parts of the rebellion the others wouldn't talk about. The middle of the war is missing because the middle of the war wasn't the point. Still, if I'm being honest, I'd watch a Steven Universe spin-off about the rebellion. A whole series set during the war, with new characters, with a chance to show us the crystal gems as a movement rather than a household. That show doesn't exist. Maybe it never will. But the gap where it could have been is a real and visible part of what the show left on the table. So that's the rebellion. We have the start. We have the end. The middle is mostly inferred. And inside that middle is a war's worth of stories the show didn't quite get round to telling. Before I sign off, let me wander through a handful of smaller mysteries, because the show has loads of them, and I don't want them to go entirely unmentioned. None of these get a full section, because none of them really need one. They're just the sort of detail you notice on a 4th or 5th rewatch and find yourself thinking about for no good reason. The first one is Onion. Onion is a small, white-haired child who lives in Beach City, and is, by every available measure, deeply strange. He doesn't speak. Well, he speaks once. in a whisper to Steven. And what he says is a normal thing, but he doesn't really speak otherwise. He's the brother of Sour Cream, the local DJ. His mother is Vidalia, an artist who used to be friends with Amethyst and Greg. His father is Yellowtail, a fisherman whose voice is essentially a series of grunts. His family is a whole vibe. The thing is, Onion does properly weird stuff. He sets things on fire. He has access to a lot of money for a small child. He has a strange room in his house full of unsettling toys. He keeps a collection of mice. He once took Steven to a hidden underground area that nobody else seemed aware of. None of this is ever explained. The show treats him as the local oddity and lets the audience make of him what we will. There's an episode called Onion Gang in season 4 that tries to explain him a bit by introducing his friend group, a set of even stranger children who live in the woods. But it actually makes him weirder, not less weird, and the show essentially abandons that thread. I don't think there's a hidden answer to Onion. I think he's just meant to be the unsettling child archetype. But every time he appears, you get the sense that the show knows something about him it isn't telling you, and that's a fun energy for a recurring character to have. There's also Cookie Cat, which is the brand of ice cream sandwich Steven sings about in the very first episode of the show. Cookie Cats apparently went out of business between seasons, and Steven never gets to eat one again throughout the entire run. The show occasionally references this. It's a small running thing, but what nobody ever asks is what actually happened to the Cookie Cat brand. Did the company go bankrupt? Was it acquired by a larger ice cream conglomerate? Did Cookie Cat, who in the jingle has a backstory involving being chased off his planet by puppies, actually exist as a character who might come back in some later episode? The show doesn't say. It just lets the brand exist as a piece of Steven's childhood that he can't access anymore, which is pretty much how all childhood snack brands work in real life. They go away. You don't get them back. That's growing up. There's also the question of the Centipedal, which is one of my favorite minor character arcs in the show. The Centipedal was a corrupted gem the crystal gems caught early in season 1. Steven manages, in a later episode, to partially heal her, bringing back enough of herself that she can communicate in a limited way, drawing pictures of her past in the sand, telling the story of what happened to her crew during the corrupting light. It's a really moving sequence. And then at the end of the show, when all the corrupted gems get healed at once, she's presumably one of them. She's restored. She's herself again. But we never specifically see her after that. We never check in to see if she's adjusted. The show fully heals her, and then doesn't follow up, and I think about her sometimes when I'm watching Future and trying to spot her in the background of Little Homeworld. Speaking of Little Homeworld, the show set up that whole community as a place for healed gems and reformed Homeworld defectors to live and learn human culture. Bismuth helps build it, Steven helps run it. There are little homes, little schools, little events, and we see fragments of life there throughout Future. But we never get a proper episode that's just about Little Homeworld as a place, what its routines look like, what its problems are, who its mayor is, whether it has its own internal politics. It's another rich corner of the universe that the show set up and then mostly used as a backdrop. There's clearly a whole community drama happening there, and we just glimpse it. There's a small relationship thing I want to mention. Two characters called Mr. Smiley and Mr. Frowny are a comedy duo from Greg's era. They used to perform together back when Greg was a young musician. Mr. Smiley still runs the local funland in Beach City. Mr. Frowny has, by the time of the show, retired and become reclusive. There's an episode where Steven tries to reunite them, and it sort of works and they have a moment, and then the show essentially never comes back to them. Whether they're friends again, whether they're touring again, whether either of them is doing okay, none of that gets followed up. They're another piece of the show's world that the writers built carefully and then let stand. And then there's the music. The Diamonds, when they did the corrupting light at the end of the rebellion, sang. The attack had a specific musical motif, which gets called back to throughout the show in moments that connect to corruption. Nephrite, the Centipedal, in her gem form, describes the attack as a song, whether the music is the attack itself or just the byproduct of the attack or something else. The show is a bit cagey. There are theories that the diamond's powers are fundamentally musical somehow. The gems generally are tied to song, that the whole magical system has a sonic element to it. The show flirts with this idea but doesn't commit. It's a thread in the world building that you can spot if you're paying attention, but that never gets formally articulated. I could go on. I won't. The show has so many of these little background details that it's almost embarrassing how rich its world is. Greg's family, his parents who were strict and overbearing, who we ran away from, who we eventually see in a single photograph in future, and never meet otherwise. The reef, the place where pearls go to be repaired, which we visit once and never properly explore. The whole of Homeworld and Era 3, which is going through enormous social changes off-screen, while the show focuses on Beach City. Any of these could be its own section. They aren't, because we'd be here all night. Well, we are here all night, but you understand what I mean. There's one more I want to mention before we wrap, because it's the kind of thing that always struck me as strange. Connie's parents, Doug and Priyanka Maheswaran. They're these perfectly ordinary humans. Doug's a security guard. Priyanka is a doctor. And they spend most of the show with no real idea what their daughter is up to. Connie is sword fighting. Connie is fusing with Steven into Stevani, a fully separate person who is sometimes their daughter and sometimes not. Connie is going on missions to other planets. Connie is, by any reasonable parental measure, doing some pretty alarming things, and the show only really addresses this in fits and starts. There's a great episode called Nightmare Hospital, where Priyanka catches them sneaking around and has to grapple with what her daughter has been doing. There's an episode in future where Connie has to start applying to colleges, and her mom's involved in a normal, recognizable parental way. But the actual question of whether Doug and Priyanka know about Stevani, whether they fully understand what their daughter has experienced, whether they've had to process the existence of magical alien beings as a family, that's only ever sort of dealt with. They get told things, they presumably accept them. The full emotional landscape of being the parents of a teenager who occasionally turns into a different gendered young adult by hugging her best friend is something the show holds at arm's length, which is fair, in a way. Children's cartoons aren't always going to dive into the existential implications of fusion for the adult in the protagonist's life, but it does leave a quietly enormous question hanging. While we're on the subject of parents in Beach City, there's also the broader question of Sour Cream's family situation. His biological father is Marty, a sleazy music industry guy from Greg's past who showed up briefly in flashbacks and turned out to also be the producer of Sadie's mum back in the day. His stepfather, the man who raised him, is Yellowtail the fisherman. There's a whole episode where Sour Cream has tension with Yellowtail because Yellowtail disapproves of the loud music. That episode is genuinely lovely. But the deeper question, how Vidalia and Yellowtail came together, where Marty is now, whether Sour Cream has any relationship with his biological dad as an adult, gets touched on a couple of times and then dropped. There's a whole family drama there that the show hints at and never fully explores, which fits the pattern by now. The show plants the seeds, lets them sit in the soil, and gets on with whatever it's actually trying to say. And one final little thing, because we're already here, the bracelet. In the very first episode that introduces Connie, there's a flashback where Steven sees her at a parade as a younger child, sees her drop her bracelet, and keeps it in his freezer for a year so he can return it to her if they ever meet again. It's a sweet detail. It establishes something about Steven, about his fundamental decency. The bracelet itself is an object that, when you start thinking about it, is a slightly odd relic of their pre-friendship. The freezer is a strange place to put it. The whole thing, when you look at it from a certain angle, reads like a tiny weird obsession that Steven is barely aware he had. The show plays it as adorable, which it is, but there's also something interesting underneath about the way kids invest in tiny totems of people they don't actually know. The bracelet eventually gets returned to Connie, and the show moves on. But it's the kind of detail that hangs around in the back of your head if you're someone who notices objects in stories. So that's 12 mysteries, plus a handful of smaller ones, plus the general background hum of unanswered questions that any properly long-running show generates over time. I want to be honest about something now that we're at the end. None of this is a criticism of Steven Universe. Going through all of it like this might make it sound like I'm complaining, or like I think the show should have done a better job tying things up. I really don't. The show is, as far as I'm concerned, a small miracle of a thing. It managed to be a children's cartoon and an adult drama at the same time, in a way that almost nothing else has pulled off. It told stories about grief and trauma and identity and love in a register that worked for all of its audiences at once. It treated its queer characters with a casual respect that genuinely changed what was possible on American children's television. It introduced people to therapy and processing and the slow work of healing in a way that, judging by the response to it over the years, helped a lot of people. That's an enormous achievement. The unresolved threads aren't a bug. They're part of the texture. A show that resolved everything would feel different. Tidier, maybe, but also smaller. Steven Universe is the size it is partly because so much of it is implied, half-glimpsed, mentioned, and set aside. The world feels lived in because there are corners we don't go into. That's how real places feel. You don't know of everything about your own town. You don't know what every person you've ever met is doing now. There are loads of stories happening alongside yours that you've heard about and never followed up. The mind fills it in, makes it real. So when the chest in the lion's mane is open in the background of one shot in the movie and nobody explains it, that's a feature. When Mystery Girl appears once in the audience at a concert and never speaks to Pearl again, that's a feature. When the cluster sits in the Earth's core, calmed but not cured, that's a feature. The show is asking you to live with the unfinishedness of it, the way you live with the unfinishedness of your own life. There's a thing the show does in its very last scene, which is one of my favorite bits. Steven, having gone through everything he's gone through, is leaving Beach City. He's grown up. He needs to go figure out who he is when he isn't a hero. And the way the show ends is just him driving away, with the soft acknowledgement that what comes next is his own to discover, and we don't get to see it. That feels right to me, somehow. The show was always going to end with things left undone, Steven's arc included. It's also worth saying, while we're on this, that the unanswered things in Steven Universe age really well. I've come back to the show 2 or 3 times since it ended, and the loose ends don't bother me more on rewatch. They bother me less. Each time I notice another small thing the show set up and didn't follow through on, and each time I feel a bit more affection for the choice. It's the same energy as flipping through an old photo album and finding a blurry picture of someone you can't quite remember the name of. The blurriness isn't a flaw of the album. The blurriness is part of why the album is worth keeping. The picture wouldn't be the same if it were sharp. If you're still awake, thanks for sticking with me through all that. If you've drifted off somewhere along the way, I hope it was a soft landing. Either way, the show is still there, sitting on its various streaming services, waiting to be rewatched whenever you fancy it. The garden's still there too in canon, drifting through space. Lion's still on the beach. The chest is still open. The cluster's still down in the core, getting on with its long, quiet existence. None of it is going anywhere. I might come back to this kind of thing, wandering through unanswered questions in shows I love, if it turns out you like it. There are a lot of shows with the same texture, I think. Ones where the things left out matter as much as the things put in. We'll see. Sleep well, mate. I'll see you in the next one.